and welcome to another episode of It's a History podcast. I am your host, Madison, and in today's episode, we are asking ourselves, why George Washington? What was it about Washington that made him the man suitable to lead our nation? We will look at George himself and a little bit about the conflicts surrounding the Articles of Confederation, the Constitutional Convention of 1787, and some of Washington's presidency. In this episode, we are going to pretty much fly over the French and Indian War and the Revolution. I will mention them, but I will not be going into any major details of these two events. So, who exactly is George Washington? How did he become the man for the job? George Washington was born in 1732 to a Virginia planter family. His father had died unexpectedly when he was 11 years old. This unexpected death prevented Washington from receiving the same Latin-based education his two older brothers received from the Appleby School in England. His schooling from 11 to 16 was most likely through private tutors or possibly a local school in his area. Washington would study up on reading and writing, basic legal forms, as well as geometry and trigonometry. This was largely to prepare himself for his first job as a surveyor. When he was just 16, he helped Thomas Lord Fairfax to survey Shenandoah. It is also noted that Washington studied up on manners, which would influence him for the rest of his life, as this had shaped his character and conduct. Washington had hand-copied 110 rules out of Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior in Company and Conversation. These rules were originally drawn from a popular English text, Youth's Behavior or Decency in Conversation Amongst Men, which was itself an adaptation of a 1595 work written by French Jesuit priests. The rules instruct students to practice consideration and respect towards others by paying careful attention to body language, dress, and speech. A few examples of these rules include Rule 1. Every action done in company ought to be with some sign of respect to those that are present. And Rule 35. Let your discourse with men of business be short and comprehensive. I had read a book during college on Washington as president, and I remember very vividly a passage about Washington having an unexpected official visitor during dinner while he was dressed in more casual wear. He left the dinner to change into his more formal wear, clothes that were more like his uniform for president, before he would conduct business with the individual. Before I get too far into this episode, we need to address slavery. Both George Washington and Martha Washington had ownership of quite a large population of enslaved people. It would be wrong to state all of Washington's accomplishments without reminding everyone that without the use of slave labor, Mount Vernon would not be able to undergo multiple expansions or be landscaped in its picturesque way. This topic deserves its own episode, which is what I am working on next. Stay tuned for next week's episode where I plan to cover the Washington's relationship to slavery, their use of slave labor, and the various laws and acts that came out regarding slavery during the beginning years of the United States, as well as Washington's own personal beliefs on the matter. Before his role in the Revolution, George managed his lands around Mount Vernon. The office of the president was not Washington's first foray with political office. He had had other positions within local government before. For example, from 1949 to 1950, he was surveyor of Culpeper County in the then colony of Virginia. As he grew into a young adult, he pursued a military career and he fought in what would be the first skirmishes of the French and Indian War. His experiences during this war heavily influenced his actions during the Revolutionary War and ultimately his approach to politics. During this war, Washington was eventually promoted to lieutenant colonel from major and would actually become head of the regiment in 1755. He would later be elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses, as well as being named a delegate to the Continental Congress. This is where Washington would be appointed commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. Having married a widowed Martha Dandridge Custis at 26 in 1759, the interwar period had been made up of times in which Washington was doing his best to live a happy and fulfilled life. Martha had been married previously to a wealthy plantation owner, Daniel Parke Custis, and after his death, she inherited the Custis estate. Martha had had 2 living children with her first husband, but her and Washington were not able to have any children of their own. This could have been one of 2 reasons. Washington had had a bout of smallpox earlier in his life, which may have rid him sterile, and Martha may have had a serious injury during the birth of her last child that may have made it impossible for her to carry any more children. Either of these issues would have made it impossible for them to have children of their own. The 2 would raise Martha's children, as well as many nieces and nephews over the years. As a man with a large landholding and gaining a substantial political career, Washington was soon considered part of the political and social elite in Virginia. When did the feelings against the British start to change? For Washington personally, the negative feelings for the British first started when he was passed up on a promotion into the regular army. Washington was a distinguished member of the army and would have rightfully felt snubbed. Then the taxing without representation began. Washington and other colonists were angered by the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which banned American settlement west of the Allegheny Mountains, while also protecting the British fur trade, which at the time was still one of the most lucrative businesses coming out of the colonies. Washington, having been quite a successful surveyor of land, encouraged adventurers to acquire backcountry western lands in 1767. Let's not forget that this land was already being lived on by Native Americans. We have to keep this time period in perspective. Some of Washington's other opinions include the Stamp Act of 1765 being an act of oppression, which he would later celebrate the repeal of. The Stamp Act had required that many printed materials in the colonies had to be produced on stamped paper from London, which included an embossed revenue stamp. This tax also had to be paid in British currency and could not be paid with local colonial money. Washington would also help to lead widespread protests against the Townshend Acts passed in 1767. These acts included the Revenue Act of 1767, the Commissioners Act of 1767, the Indemnity Act of 1767, the New York Restraining Act of 1767, and the Vice Admiralty Act of 1768. According to Wikipedia, the main purpose of these acts were to raise revenue in the colonies to pay the salaries of governors and judges so that they would remain loyal to Great Britain, create more effective means of enforcing compliance with trade regulations, punish the province of New York for failing to comply with the 1765 Quartering Act, and establish the precedent that the British Parliament had the right to tax the colonies. Why all of the taxes on the colonies? The short answer, Britain was in some major debt. After the 7 Years' War, Britain decided to leverage the colonies as a way to increase their tax revenue. The colonists were, of course, upset that they were being taxed without representation through the British Parliament. Parliament claimed that Americans were represented by virtual representation, which was the belief that members of Parliament spoke for all British subjects, not just the ones that they were representing, which would have included all of the colonists. Now we enter the Revolutionary War. At the meeting of the Second Continental Congress, Washington was unanimously nominated and elected as the commander-in-chief, which would give him supreme control over the entire military. I thought to myself, why Washington? Of course he had a pretty extensive and successful military career, but what about everybody else who was there? I looked into it, and it turns out that Washington was the most experienced military leader the Continental Congress had. Out of a group of 56 men, it looks like only 3 of them had any military experience, and one of them had been Washington. Most everyone else were lawyers, politicians, merchants, or farmers, so not really fit to lead a national army. Washington would appear in uniform before Congress to accept the position, decline a salary, and give an acceptance speech. Again, like the 7 Years' War, we're going to fly over the Revolution for time purposes, and of course, there are Washington's greatest hits, such as crossing the Delaware or Valley Forge, but we are going to move on to the afterwar period. After the war, George wished nothing more but to retire to his home at Mount Vernon, but he soon realized that the nation, under its current governing practices of the Articles of Confederation, was not functioning well. What were the Articles of Confederation, you ask? Well, the Articles of Confederation were debated upon by the 13 colonies and came into practice on March 1st, 1781, after having been ratified by all colonies. The Articles purposefully made a weak federal government to protect the independence of the states. With the states having so much power, there was not much the federal government could do to regulate the country. The federal government was having difficulties regulating commerce, it could not tax, and it could not effectively support a war effort. The government was also dealing with a depleted treasury, as well as dealing with inflation due to paper money flooding the country. There was little to no power to settle interstate disagreements, especially when it came to territory. Governments need money to run, and the Articles pretty much made it impossible to raise funds for the government. By 1787, we were back to the drawing board on how to run a government. At the Constitutional Convention, delegates from each state would work hard over the summer months to create a new government. This is where our current government comes from, with its 3 branches, the checks and balances, all that fun stuff. At the start of the convention, Washington was once again unanimously elected to be president of the convention. He was a strong proponent for the federal government. When it came time to decide who would lead, it was proposed that the executive branch consist of a single person. It is thought that the prospect of George Washington eventually becoming the first president of the United States had led to this idea to have more weight than others. During the first presidential election, only 43,782 people voted, which made up only 1.8% of the population. George Washington won pretty much 100% of the popular vote and received a majority of the electoral vote. John Adams was second on the list and will be elected to be vice president. He was inaugurated on April 30th, 1789, taking the oath of office at Federal Hall in New York City, the first home of the president. How did George Washington run the office of the president? As the first president of the United States, Washington would be setting the precedent for all presidents after him. He did not infringe on the policy-making powers of Congress given to them by the Constitution, but he largely believed that as the president, foreign policy would fall under the category of presidential concern. When France and England fell into a major war after the start of the French Revolution, Washington refused to side with either country, much to the dissatisfaction of Francophile Thomas Jefferson and pro-England Alexander Hamilton. Instead of picking a side, he decided to stay neutral until the United States itself was a stronger nation. The US had literally just become a country, it still needed some time to figure itself out. Washington preferred to be called Mr. President instead of His Excellency that the Senate proposed. After his first term, he planned to resign, but due to political strife at the time, he remained in office. For all intents and purposes, Washington was definitely the right man for the job. He was a good judge of talent and character, regularly talked with his department heads to get their advice, he tolerated opposing views, and had a smooth transition to his successor. He remained nonpartisan throughout his presidency and openly opposed the divisiveness of political parties in favor of a strong central government. He was once again unanimously elected by the Electoral College for his second term with John Adams as vice president. After a second term, Washington declined to run for a third term, which every president until FDR followed in suit. After FDR, it was made so that presidents could only run for 2 terms. Washington was not a fan of political parties and was sorely disappointed when he saw the beginnings of political parties forming as his time in office came to a close. At his farewell address, he warned the nation of 3 dangers to the nation: regionalism, partisanship, and foreign entanglements. He also really advised against getting involved in European conflicts. As with most figures from the past, we have to contend the good they did with the bad or problematic views that they held. Washington set many precedents for the national government and for the presidency, but he also had several personal beliefs and practices that routinely went against enslaved people and Native Americans. This will be discussed in next week's episode as it deserves its own space to be told. Thank you for listening to today's episode, and I hope you learned something new because I know I did. Sources for this episode include the White House website, the National Archives, Wikipedia, and George Washington's Mount Vernon website. The Mount Vernon website has many different articles that cover all aspects of Washington. If you liked what you heard, please leave a review and subscribe to It's a History Podcast. If you have any questions, comments, or topic ideas, please email me at itsahistorypodcast@gmail.com with no apostrophe. Thank you again, and I hope to have you in the next one.